In the opening months of 1942, the Pacific sky felt as if it belonged to Japan. Each morning, above turquoise water and green islands, the rising sun insignia gleamed on wings that seemed untouchable. The Mitsubishi Zero sliced the air with a hawk's grace. In contrast, many American fighters appeared slower, heavier, and outmatched. On airstrips and carrier decks, U.S. pilots strapped into machines that often felt a step behind. Some muttered that they were flying into odds no machine could redeem. Confidence came not from design, but from duty and grit. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, it had not yet absorbed the scale and tempo of what the Pacific would require. American naval aviation was strong in spirit, but still catching up in doctrine, range, and reliability for the vast distances of the island arcs. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was sturdy and brave, but no one mistook it for a ballerina. The Brewster F2A Buffalo had already disappointed and would soon be relegated or replaced. In early clashes, the Zero could climb and turn with ease while many American fighters bled energy to keep up. Pilots saw it up close. So did ground crews who inspected airframes pocked by cannon fire and scarred by flames. In those first months over the Philippines, Wake Island, the Netherlands East Indies, and the waters around Rabaul, American pilots faced nightmare odds. The details differed from place to place. In the Philippines, U.S. Army pilots often fought in P-40s against skilled opponents who attacked with surprise and speed. At Wake Island, the Marine aviators flew F4F Wildcats that fought fiercely and left their mark before the island fell. In the Netherlands East Indies, the Dutch fought with F2A Buffaloes and paid dearly while buying time for the Allied cause. The names of aircraft varied across these battles, but the feeling was the same. Outnumbered formations, exhausted crews, and long odds against a confident adversary. To the Japanese pilots, those early victories felt like confirmation of everything they had trained for. Their aircraft were light, nimble, and deadly in the hands of veterans who had honed their skills in China and in the years before Pearl Harbor. They saw American machines that could not match a Zero in a flat turn, and they pressed that edge at will. Ready rooms and forward bases were lively with the energy of men who believed their doctrine was proven. Confidence grew sortie by sortie as they returned with victory counts and stories that traveled across the fleet. Yet, inside the silence of ruined revetments and under the shade of palm trees, another story was beginning to take shape. Defeat was forcing a hard education. The Americans were cataloging mistakes and recording every pattern they could see. Pilots who survived wrote blunt reports. Maintenance crews and officers sent parts and photographs back to stateside factories. There was nothing romantic about it. It was a cold study of survival. What failed, what bent, what burned, which tactics led to disaster and which could be refined into something workable. There was also a thread of hope woven through the scars. The Wildcat, for all its limitations, could take punishment and bring a pilot home. It had self-sealing tanks. It carried armor. It could dive hard and remain intact. A Zero could twist and climb with elegance, but when struck it was fragile. It sacrificed protection for performance. A single burst that found the tanks could turn a victory roll into a funeral trail of smoke. These truths were not theories. They were scrawled in bullet holes and recorded in lives saved. On February 20th, 1942, that thread of hope became a bright line across the sky. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, flying an F4F Wildcat from the carrier Lexington, intercepted a formation of Japanese G4M bombers that threatened his ship. The sea and the clouds formed a pale theater as he dove to attack. He fired with calm precision. One bomber fell, then another. He repositioned and struck again, his guns coughing fire as the Wildcat absorbed the recoil and kept its line. By the time he returned, nearly out of ammunition and blackened by exhaust and sweat, 5 enemy bombers had been destroyed. It was one action on one day, yet it carried the weight of a new belief that skill and toughness could bend the balance. Moments like this were small lights in a dark season. They suggested that survival was not luck alone. It could be engineered. It could be trained. In ready rooms across the fleet, pilots practiced a new language of teamwork that would become the grammar of their war. Pair flying, mutual support, and disciplined formations replaced the urge to duel. The famous weave tactic matured from an idea into a muscle memory. Pilots learned to refuse the Zero's invitation to turn. They learned to fight by diving, by using altitude as a bank account of energy, and by shooting only when the sight picture was solid. Far from the front, factories and design shops joined the learning. Blueprints were updated, shops retooled. Test stands roared through the night in places like Long Island and Connecticut, where rugged naval fighters and powerful engines were being refined with each incoming report. In California and across the American interior, the training pipeline expanded to turn raw recruits into competent aviators. The transformation was not glamorous. It was a grind. It was patience applied to steel and aluminum and human nerves. Back in the islands and along the carrier decks, the outward picture had not yet changed. Japanese formations still swept in with confidence. The Zero remained a terror in the flat turn and a swift hunter when it had the first move. But the texture of combat began to shift in subtle ways. Wildcats returned with pilots who had used dives to live. Sections covered each other and broke off at the right moment. Radio discipline improved. The number of lessons that had to be learned the hard way began to decrease. On the ground, armorers adjusted sighting procedures and ammunition belts to match what pilots had discovered worked best. The first stage of America's air war in the Pacific was never about winning beautiful battles. It was about not dying needlessly. It was about making sure each mission taught something that the next mission could use. When a pilot limped back to a strip cut from coral or to a swaying flight deck with an engine coughing and a wing torn, that landing was more than a personal triumph. It was one more page for the engineers. It was one more briefing worth attending. It was one more chance to turn failure into an instrument of change. For a while longer, the Pacific still seemed to belong to Japan. The headlines painted the enemy as invincible and the American effort as a string of standstills and retreats. Yet the reality under the surface was different. The American machine was learning how to fight this war. It was building a new identity out of setbacks and building new airplanes out of hard facts. The day would come when the lessons learned in early 1942 would reveal their full power. The airplane that had once seemed the weakest would be the platform on which new strength was built. The enemy would face not the same opponent, but a matured one, toughened by loss and sharpened by practice. What the early victors could not see was the slow turn of a wheel already in motion. The planes that seemed old in January would give birth to successors shaped by harsh reality. The pilots who felt outmatched in March would return as instructors or aces who taught others how to stay alive and how to win. The sky that rang with one nation's confidence would soon echo with another nation's resolve. The Pacific would tell a different story as the months passed. It would become a story of adaptation and surprise, written by crews who refused to fold and by machines whose true strength was not grace, but durability. Before it could frighten anyone, the machine that would shape the Pacific Air War began as an awkward answer to a new set of problems. In the late 1930s, the United States Navy wanted a modern monoplane fighter that could live on a moving ship, leap from short decks, and survive the punishment of salt, spray, and hard landings. Biplanes were graceful on approach and forgiving to fly, but the future did not belong to them. Speed and range were climbing every year. Steel carriers were replacing guesses with doctrine. The Bureau of Aeronautics called for a fighter that could meet the modern world at sea. Brewster answered early with a sleek-looking design that promised much on paper. The F-2A Buffalo had the lines of progress and the claim of being the Navy's first monoplane fighter to reach squadron service. Early trials suggested a step forward. Then reality added pounds. The Navy required radios, armor plate, larger guns, stronger landing gear, and eventually self-sealing fuel tanks. Every pound of protection and equipment took a bite out of climb and agility. The Buffalo that flew in squadron service carried more weight than the prototype, and the loss in performance showed up in the most unforgiving classroom in the world. Grumman pushed a rival design that did not pretend to be delicate. The F4F Wildcat looked sturdy because it was sturdy. It arrived with the blunt honesty of a tool that planned to work for a living. On paper, it was not the fastest fighter in the world. It was not the lightest. It was not going to win a turning contest against the most agile opponents. What it could do was keep a pilot alive, bring him back to the ship, and take abuse that would wreck a more fragile airframe. The Navy was watching the same global winds that everyone else felt. Europe was already at war. The Pacific was crackling. The service hedged its bets and kept both types moving while squadrons trained and the sea tested everything. As the months rolled into the first year of the full war, the Buffalo's flaws came into focus. Production delays and quality issues set nerves on edge. Added equipment made the airplane heavier than its engine liked. In hot and humid tropical air, climb rates sagged and acceleration dulled. Pilots reported that the machine felt out of breath when asked to fight against opponents that seemed to have air to spare. Foreign service gave mixed results. The Dutch fought bravely with their Buffaloes in the Netherlands East Indies. The British Commonwealth flew the type in the Malayan campaign under harsh conditions. The Finns, using the lighter B-239 export version with different equipment and practice tactics, found ways to score in a very different theater. Those contrasts taught a quiet lesson. Context matters. Weight matters. Training and doctrine matter most of all. The United States Navy took the lesson to heart. The Buffalo's early promise could not overcome its growing pains and its production issues, and the Wildcat became the backbone of carrier fighter groups in the critical first year. It was not a romantic choice. It was a choice born of reliability and of a company that could deliver rugged airframes quickly and improve them on the fly. On the factory floor, Grumman's culture rewarded straightforward solutions. Mechanics could get their hands into the airplane. Parts fit. Repairs held. The Wildcat fit the deck crews who had to keep a fighter alive in a place where mistakes cost ships. Birth stories in wartime are not the tales of perfect ideas. They are the tales of imperfect machines that adapt faster than their enemies. The Wildcat carried 4 heavy machine guns at first, then 6 in later versions. By 1942, armor and self-sealing tanks were increasingly present on frontline Wildcats, which weighed the airplane down but kept pilots breathing after hits that would turn a lighter fighter into a falling torch. Its landing gear was a narrow track but very strong and well-suited to the pounding of carrier work. The Wildcat had a good reputation for absorbing damage and getting home on a hurt engine. That last trait mattered more than any number printed on a brochure. A fighter that could not return could not teach. A fighter that came back could fill briefings, write reports, and become a better fighter tomorrow. The misfit label did not belong only to the airframes. It belonged to the ideas that guided them. Early American naval air doctrine carried habits from peacetime training and from encounters with aircraft that did not match the Zero. Squadrons learned the hard way what works. The Zero could outturn almost anything that tried to play its game. The Wildcat was never going to match that dance and did not have to. Pilots who survived the first meetings began to speak a common language. Use altitude like money in the bank. Spend it in a dive. Fire with discipline. Do not be lured into a flat turn at low speed. Maintain section integrity so that one pair becomes more than 2 airplanes. Inside that shift was the best kind of engineering loop. The pilots learned in combat. The maintainers learned in the hangar. The engineers learned from both. Back at Grumman and at engine plants on the East Coast, test stands throbbed under new mixtures and new settings. Blueprints for the Wildcat were refined in 100 small ways that rarely made headlines but that pilots felt in their hands. Sights were adjusted. Ammunition belts were configured for reliability and effect. Cooling and lubrication tweaks helped engines live longer in heat. Incremental changes added up to a fighter that was not glamorous but was dependable. The misfit was becoming a professional. The Buffalo's fate remained a caution. It had the look of progress but could not carry the real burden of modern naval war in the Pacific with all the equipment that burden demanded. It had not been born a fraud. It had been born into a harsh growth spurt that turned elegant prototypes into heavy realities. That is how machines grow up. Some adapt to the weight of responsibility. Some do not. The Navy needed a fighter that could be flown hard from carriers by pilots who might have only a few months of experience and who would come home to deck crews who had to fix what battle broke. The Wildcat fit that world. Birth also means legacy. The Wildcat was never the last word. Its very limitations pointed the way to something larger and more powerful. The stream of reports and the rhythm of combat painted a clear picture. A successful Pacific carrier fighter needed brutal reliability, honest construction, thick skin, and enough engine to carry armor and guns without sagging into despair. It needed range and climb that could translate into control of the fight. These requirements marched straight into the design office where a new beast took shape with the lessons baked in from the start. While that successor gathered strength, the Wildcat kept flying and kept earning. It stood on flight decks at Midway and in the Solomons. It escorted strike groups and clawed back from ambushes. It did not win by being prettier or faster. It won by refusing to quit. In the ready rooms, pilots learned to trust its toughness. They learned that if they respected its strengths and avoided its traps, it would repay them with another sunrise and another chance to sharpen their trade. The misfit was becoming a mentor. The birth of this misfit is the plain truth of how America learned to fight in the sky over water. The Navy asked for a modern fighter and discovered that modern is a moving target. It saw a promising design limp under the weight of necessities. It chose a sturdier partner that did not panic under stress. It built an engineering and training loop that never stopped asking, what is the next small thing we can do better? Out of that persistence came a philosophy. Do not chase elegance for its own sake. Build for the way sailors and Marines actually fight. Protect the pilot. Make the machine easy to fix. Use every mistake as a map to an improvement. By the time the successor spread its wings, the foundation was in place. The engineers had their list. The factories had their tempo. The pilots had their doctrine. The Wildcat had carried the load that allowed something greater to arrive. The misfit had done its job. It had taught a generation of aviators how to live long enough to win. It had given the next design a world of data that no wind tunnel could provide. When the new fighter finally thundered off carrier decks and met the Zero on its own terms, it carried the DNA of every lesson the misfit had learned the hard way. The story of a nightmare begins with the birth of a machine that looked ordinary and even flawed. The Buffalo showed what not to carry into a modern war. The Wildcat showed what mattered when the ocean was your runway and the enemy owned the first move. Together, they produced knowledge that could be forged into a weapon that would change the war. The misfit was not an embarrassment. It was the necessary beginning. It was the rough wood that would become a hammer. And the hammer was almost ready to fall. By the middle of 1942, the Pacific Air War had begun to reveal its true character. Every mission carried lessons written in smoke and blood. The pilots who survived the early defeats were now teachers as much as warriors, shaping the way a nation learned to fight in a sky it did not yet own. The Wildcat was no miracle of design, but it was a teacher of discipline, and that discipline became the seed of doctrine. Out of desperate improvisation came a pattern that would rewrite the balance of the air. At first, the contrast between the two sides remained brutal. The Japanese Zero could twist, climb, and roll with a lightness that seemed impossible. Its pilots, many of them hardened by years of experience in China, knew every maneuver by heart. American aviators were still finding their rhythm, still learning how to fight from the decks of carriers rather than the comfort of land bases. The Wildcat could not match the Zero's grace. It could not rely on instinct or bravado. What it had instead was toughness and teamwork, and those would soon prove to be more durable weapons than elegance. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, a thoughtful and analytical pilot, understood this before most. Watching how the Zero could outturn nearly every Allied plane, he realized that victory would not come from chasing. It would come from cooperation. In his mind, the solution was geometry. He sketched lines and arcs on paper and designed a formation where two pairs of fighters flew side by side. When an enemy dove on one pair, they would both turn toward each other. In that moment, the attacker, focused on his target, would cross directly in front of the guns of the supporting wingman. It was a simple concept, born of logic and necessity. Thatch called it the weave. The Thatch weave was not born in theory alone. It was tested in combat over Midway and in the Solomons, where pilots found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. What began as a drawing became a living pattern in the sky. Reports flowed in from squadrons that had tried it and survived. Pilots who once believed the Zero unbeatable began to see cracks in its armor, both literal and psychological. For the first time, they felt that they could fight back on their own terms. Tactics were only one part of the transformation. Training followed. The Navy and Marine Corps began to build a culture that emphasized thinking in pairs and sections rather than as lone heroes. The lone wolf, so celebrated in romantic stories of the First World War, no longer had a place in the Pacific. The vastness of the ocean punished isolation. Radio discipline, visual communication, and teamwork replaced flair. The Wildcat's slower speed forced coordination. Pilots learned to use altitude and dive speed as tools rather than showpieces. The phrase boom and zoom became the rhythm of their survival. Climb high, strike fast, then dive away before the Zero could turn the tables. This slow reshaping of doctrine was happening while the war itself was racing forward. Each carrier battle compressed months of theory into minutes of decision. Midway proved the value of preparation and patience. The Americans could no longer rely on matching the enemy plane for plane. They had to think in layers, combining intelligence, timing, and formation discipline to make their limited numbers count. The Wildcat, though outclassed in raw performance, became the platform on which this new mindset stood. Inside the ready rooms, the mood was changing. The early shock of 1942 had hardened into focus. Pilots shared diagrams, notes, and the practical advice that saved lives. Never dogfight a Zero, one would remind the new arrivals. Climb above him, dive through, and never let him behind you. Those who ignored this wisdom often did not return. Those who listened began to build kill counts that earlier months would have thought impossible. Names like Joe Foss, Marion Carl, and others began to spread across the fleet. They were not aces because their machines were faster. They were aces because they used every ounce of the Wildcat's strengths and turned discipline into instinct. The technical side of the Navy was adapting as fast as the pilots. Engineers and ordnance officers refined weapon harmonization so that the streams of .50 caliber rounds converged where they mattered. Mechanics adjusted engines to squeeze out a few more knots. Production lines began to incorporate feedback from the front almost immediately. It was not just pilots learning to fight smarter. The entire system was learning to fight smarter. Factories became classrooms, and the Wildcat became a textbook. Meanwhile, the Japanese were beginning to feel the cost of their early dominance. The Zero remained an extraordinary aircraft, but it was a fragile one, and its aces were irreplaceable. Japan had entered the war with a limited pool of elite pilots. Each loss was more than a number on a chart. It was the disappearance of years of experience that could not be quickly rebuilt. The Americans, by contrast, were building an industrial machine that could train faster, repair faster, and produce faster. Doctrine and production were merging into one continuous rhythm. Every improvement multiplied itself across hundreds of airplanes. By late 1942 and into 1943, the Wildcat's reputation had changed. It was no longer dismissed as a stopgap. It had become a symbol of resilience. Its very limitations had forced its pilots to invent new tactics that outlived it. Even as the next-generation fighter was being built, the Wildcat still flew from smaller escort carriers and remote fields, proving again and again that survivability and training could compensate for speed and grace. The misfit of yesterday was now the workhorse of today. Each battle reinforced the lesson. A pilot who trusted his wingman and followed the playbook could come home even against superior numbers. A pilot who tried to duel the Zero as an equal often vanished into the sea. Slowly, the psychological balance began to shift. The Americans were no longer flying in fear. They were flying with method. The Japanese could feel it. Encounters that once felt effortless now demanded caution. The same formations that had been easy prey were suddenly coordinated, disciplined, and dangerous. Doctrine was being forged by fire. The United States had learned that a war cannot be won by hardware alone. It required systems, teamwork, and a feedback loop that turned every failure into the seed of improvement. The Wildcat became the emblem of that philosophy. It was proof that the quality of a fighter does not rest only in its engine or wings, but in the minds that fly it and the structure that supports it. When John Thatch's weave was taught across squadrons, it carried with it a deeper message. The age of the lone duelist was over. The new age belonged to those who could think as a unit, coordinate as a machine, and execute without hesitation. It was doctrine not born in classrooms but in battle, tested over blue water, refined in every fight for survival. By the time the lessons of 1942 had been absorbed, the American approach to aerial combat had changed forever. The Wildcat, the so-called underdog, had been the forge that tempered that change. Its thick skin and dependable engine had carried the burden long enough for an entire generation of pilots to learn what worked. What came next would take those lessons and multiply them tenfold. The new fighter rising in the factories of Long Island would not only inherit the Wildcat's spirit, but amplify it. The doctrine was ready. The pilots were ready. The enemy did not yet know it. But the next phase of the war was about to begin, and the skies of the Pacific would soon belong to a new generation of fighters born from the patience, pain, and precision that the Wildcat had taught. By 1943, the lessons carved into the skin of the Wildcat had become blueprints for something new. The U.S. Navy understood what it needed now, not a delicate racer, but a brawler that could hit hard, take punishment, and dominate the vast skies of the Pacific. Out of the workshops of Grumman on Long Island came an airplane that would carry those lessons to their ultimate form. Its name was the F6F Hellcat, and though it would soon become the most successful carrier fighter of the war, it began in the same way as its predecessor, born not from perfection, but from relentless learning. When the Navy's planners conceived a successor to the Wildcat, they faced a careful balance. The airplane had to be faster and more powerful, yet it also had to retain the toughness and steadiness that carrier life demanded. Pilots needed range to chase the enemy across the ocean, but they could not afford to lose the armor and self-sealing tanks that kept them alive. Early discussions at Grumman were about practicality. The pilots had spoken through their reports from Midway and Guadalcanal. Their message was clear. Give us more horsepower, more firepower, better visibility, and a machine that can meet or exceed the zero in the climb and still dominate in a dive. Grumman's engineers, grounded and methodical, listened. They designed the new fighter around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial that was already proving itself in other top-tier American fighters. The selection was more than a choice of engine. It was a statement of intent. The Americans would bring overwhelming power. The airframe grew around that power plant like armor around a heart. It gained a bigger wing, stronger landing gear, and a cockpit with improved visibility. The design kept the virtues that deck crews and pilots trusted, while adding the energy that earlier machines had lacked. The prototype took to the air in late June 1942, the same month that Midway had been fought and won. Test pilots said it felt like a Wildcat scaled up in all the right ways, stable and predictable, yet with abundant power. Open the throttle and the Hellcat surged forward with a confidence that pilots felt in their backs. It climbed better, dove harder, and accelerated out of danger with authority. The Navy saw the answer it needed. Production began before the year's end. In early 1943, frontline squadrons received their first examples for training, and by late summer the type began to appear in combat. For many pilots who had survived the Wildcat, the transition felt like moving from a faithful workhorse to a thoroughbred. They respected the Wildcat. They loved the Hellcat. The heart of the Hellcat's success was not only its engine, but its philosophy. The airplane was designed around pilot survival and fighting efficiency. The cockpit was roomy and protected with armor plate. The windscreen carried bullet-resistant glass. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. The wings folded neatly for storage yet were strong enough to sustain high-speed dives that lesser airframes could not endure. The landing gear was wide and stout, which paid dividends in the exacting dance of carrier landings. Armament remained the trusted battery of 650 caliber machine guns, typically with 400 rounds per gun. That gave the Hellcat devastating firepower without the weight and maintenance complexity of cannon in a salt and spray environment. With its power and lift, the fighter could take that armament high, keep it stable in the firing pass, and then leave the fight in a dive if needed. Pilots discovered another quality that numbers alone do not capture. The Hellcat was friendly to fly. It forgave mistakes. It tracked well in the gun run and behaved predictably in the groove on approach. For experienced men, this built instant trust. For new aviators arriving from an expanded training pipeline, it was a gift. The Navy needed a fighter that could absorb the learning curve of thousands of fresh pilots and still bring them home. The Hellcat met that need. Across the Pacific, Japanese airmen began to notice that a new American fighter had entered the stage. At first, the change was subtle. Then it became unmistakable. Encounters that once tilted toward the Zero began to end differently. The new American plane could climb with Japanese fighters and was far more dangerous in the vertical. When the fight turned downward, it vanished in a dive that the Zero did not like to follow, then reappeared from a new angle with a long burst that tore fabric and structure apart. The Zero's agility remained impressive, but its lack of armor and self-sealing tanks left it vulnerable to even brief strikes from heavy American guns. The edge that had seemed permanent was slipping. The first extended tests of this new balance appeared in late 1943 during the fighting in the Solomons and the Marshall Islands. Carrier groups and land-based squadrons reported outcomes that looked different from the grim tallies of 1942. Kill ratios that once favored Japan now turned sharply in the other direction. In some engagements, American pilots downed many enemy aircraft for the loss of very few of their own. Reports highlighted the same themes. The Hellcat had the speed and altitude performance to dictate terms and the ruggedness to survive hits that would have destroyed earlier types. Japan could not replace its most experienced pilots with the speed that America was now producing and training new ones. The skill gap reversed, and with it the tone of the war in the air. The reasons were as much industrial as they were tactical. Grumman's Bethpage plant ran day and night with a reputation for delivering machines that worked and could be repaired quickly. Workers called the place the Iron Works with pride. Between 1942 and 1945, the company produced more than 12,000 Hellcats. Standardized parts, efficient systems, and a logistics network that reached across the ocean turned each airplane into a reliable part of a larger machine. Damaged fighters returned to service. Lost fighters were replaced. Carriers sailed with confidence that spare parts and trained crews could keep their air groups sharp. Japan could not keep pace. Blockade, resource shortages, and mounting losses squeezed its industry and training in ways that no courage could solve. When the first squadrons rotated home and filed their reports, the notes read like a steady endorsement. Pilots praised the engine's strength, the visibility from the cockpit, the sturdiness under fire, and the forgiving nature of its landing behavior. For carrier aviation, these qualities mattered as much as speed. A fighter that wins the dogfight but cannot return to the deck does not win the campaign. The Hellcat did both. By early 1944, the Hellcat had transformed the aerial balance in the Pacific. The sky that had once belonged to the Zero now tilted strongly toward the U.S. Navy. The change did not rest on a single number or a single heroic moment. It rested on a philosophy turned into metal and training. The Americans had built a fighter that was not simply newer, but truer to what the war required. The Hellcat was the visible proof that learning, paired with industry, can overtake any head start. The pilots who climbed down from Hellcat cockpits after long missions felt that truth in their bones. The Wildcat had kept them alive in the worst days. The Hellcat was allowing them to win. By the summer of 1943, the Hellcat had moved from the test fields of Long Island to the blazing heart of the Pacific. The quiet hours of factory work and training flights were over. The new fighter was about to meet its reason for existence. When the first carrier squadron sailed with their decks lined with blue and gray Hellcats, they carried not only a weapon, but the weight of a nation's learning. The next battles would determine whether all those lessons of Midway and Guadalcanal had truly built something capable of dominating the sky. The first combat test came on August 31st, 1943, during the raids on Marcus Island. It was a small atoll with outsized strategic value, and the mission marked the Hellcat's debut in real battle. Pilots found that everything they had been told in training was true. The airplane climbed with authority, dove with stability, and stayed predictable even under stress. The first victories came quickly. Within weeks, Hellcat squadrons were engaging Zeros and other Japanese fighters across the Central Pacific. The reports that returned from those early clashes were clear and confident. The U.S. Navy finally had an airplane that could meet the Zero on its own terms and still dictate the fight. As 1943 turned to 1944, the Hellcat's baptism became a full eruption. The Solomon Islands campaign intensified, and the Pacific turned into a proving ground on a continental scale. The skies above Bougainville, Tarawa, and the Marshall Islands became theaters of transformation. The U.S. Navy was no longer surviving. It was setting the terms of battle. With altitude on their side, Hellcat pilots could dive, strike, and pull away before the Zero could respond. This tactical rhythm became routine. American formations arrived where they were needed, struck hard, and broke away to fight again on favorable ground, turning individual skill into a system that repeated itself day after day. Each engagement revealed the Hellcat's dual nature. It was a killing machine when unleashed, and also a protector. Pilots repeatedly returned from missions with aircraft that bore scars which would have destroyed earlier types. Armor, self-sealing tanks, and the robust double-wasp engine delivered survival in cases that once ended in smoke and salt water. That reliability changed the psychology of combat. Confidence replaced hesitation. Squadrons pressed the attack knowing that their machines would forgive a mistake and bring them home even if hurt. By the time the Marshalls and the Marianas came under assault in 1944, the Hellcat was the centerpiece of carrier aviation. On the decks of the Essex-class carriers, its folded wings stood shoulder to shoulder, an industrial forest of metal ready to unfold into speed and fire. Maintenance crews worked with a rhythm that turned damage control into an art. Aircraft cycled through refuel, rearm, and repair with a certainty that kept air groups strong. For Japanese pilots, each new encounter felt more desperate. The Zero could still outturn an opponent at low speed, but it could no longer dictate the terms of the fight against an enemy that arrived from altitude with warning from radar direction and the numbers to sustain the attack. The Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot showed the full consequence of this shift. In June 1944, hundreds of Japanese aircraft rose to defend their carriers and the approaches to Saipan. They met an American screen of Hellcats waiting at altitude, guided by radar control and fighter direction. The results were catastrophic for Japan. On the first day alone, nearly 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, while American losses were small by comparison. Pilots returned to their carriers stunned by the scale of the result. The Hellcat had moved from promise to proof. Behind those dramatic numbers lay deeper realities. The American advantage was not just about a single airplane. It was the union of aircraft, doctrine, and logistics. Carrier coordination, radar control, disciplined formations, efficient deck cycles, and relentless training all worked together to make the Hellcat more than the sum of its parts. It was a weapon integrated into a system that stretched from a pilot's gunsight to the workers who machined wing spars in the night shift. Every victory in the air was supported by the invisible hand of planning and supply. The Japanese air arm now tasted the nightmare that had haunted the Americans in 1942. Veteran aviators were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The Zero's long range and agility still mattered in the abstract, but not against opponents who arrived with warning, altitude, and numbers, and who could absorb hits and keep flying. The Hellcat's 650 caliber guns could tear through the light structure of an A6M with brief, disciplined bursts. When the Hellcat took hits in return, it often survived to land aboard a carrier or reach a friendly field. By late 1944, Hellcat pilots had claimed thousands of aerial victories across the Pacific, and the type's overall exchange rate had risen to well above 10-to-1. These figures were more than statistics. They were signals that a tide had turned. The carriers that had been hunted were now the hunters. The sound of the double wasp echoed over seas that had once seemed closed. Japanese pilots remained courageous and skilled, yet the balance of training, numbers, and equipment was gone. Even when they landed blows, the enemy refused to fall. That refusal injured not only tactics but morale. Confidence, once an advantage, became difficult to maintain. Pilots returning from the great carrier battles often described an uneasy quiet. There was pride, but not celebration. Many spoke of grim necessity. They respected their opponents even as they destroyed them. Yet they also understood what the pattern meant. The air war had become an avalanche moving one way. The Hellcat was the leading edge of that movement. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American airmen felt that momentum was fully theirs and likely to stay that way. The aircraft itself became a symbol that reached beyond its metal. It was the story of adaptation made visible. Every rivet reflected lessons paid for in earlier blood. The Wildcat's endurance, the engineer's pragmatism, the ordnance crew's refinements, and the pilot's evolving doctrine all converged in this one machine. When a Hellcat pilot strapped in and looked over the long nose at the sea, he carried more than ammunition. He carried proof that learning and persistence can outlast any early advantage. By the end of 1944, the skies over the Pacific had changed irreversibly. From the Solomons to the Philippines, the Hellcat ruled the day. The enemy, who once mocked America's early aircraft, now faced a storm that no courage could halt. The beast had truly been unleashed, and its echo would carry all the way to Tokyo Bay. Victory in war often hides behind statistics, and the Pacific Air War was no different. By late 1944, the numbers painted a story so decisive that even cautious analysts could no longer deny what had happened. The F6F Hellcat had become more than an airplane. It was the physical expression of an industrial empire and a doctrine that learned faster than its enemies could adapt. The story of its success was written not in speeches but in production figures, sorties flown, and missions survived. The United States had entered the war behind in certain areas of aircraft design, but it had never been behind in potential. American factories were vast and its workforce was tireless. The war in the Pacific proved what happens when organization meets necessity. The Grumman plant at Bethpage, New York, became a symbol of that transformation. Workers called it the Iron Works, and with good reason. The plant never truly slept. Day and night, metal sheets became wings, rivets became skeletons, and engines were tested until they glowed. In just a few years, more than 12,000 Hellcats rolled out of its doors. Each one carried improvements based on the experience of the last. It was continuous evolution, industrial Darwinism on a scale that no Axis nation could match. The Japanese aircraft industry, by contrast, was reaching its breaking point. Bombing raids on the home islands disrupted production lines, fuel supplies ran short, and experienced craftsmen were drafted into the Army. The Zero, once a miracle of engineering, increasingly suffered from material shortages and rushed assembly. Japan was still producing aircraft, but many reached squadrons with quality issues or without the seasoned pilots to fly them effectively. By 1944 and 1945, American monthly aircraft output routinely dwarfed Japan's capacity, often exceeding what Japan could produce over multiple months. This gap was more than arithmetic. It was a verdict on the two nations' ability to sustain modern war. Production alone did not guarantee victory. Training and logistics turned those numbers into power. The United States built a pipeline that turned civilians into competent aviators with rigorous ground school, link trainer time, live gunnery, and carrier qualification. The Japanese, on the other hand, could not afford lengthy courses as losses mounted. Their once elite cadre was being depleted faster than replacements could be prepared. By 1944, many new Japanese naval aviators entered combat with total flight time often under 200 hours, while their American counterparts typically arrived far better prepared through an expanded and standardized program. The result was a sky filled with unequal experience. Veterans in robust aircraft met rookies in fragile machines. Then came the missions. The Hellcat's operational record reads like an accounting ledger of dominance. In the last 2 years of the war, it flew well over 60,000 combat sorties across the Pacific, shot down more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, and supported nearly every major amphibious landing. From the Marianas to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the Hellcat became the backbone of the fleet. Its overall exchange rate against Japanese fighters averaged well above 10-to-1 in favor of the Hellcat. Some carrier groups reported even higher ratios during peak operations. Analysts scrutinized the figures, and the math continued to support the same conclusion. The Hellcat had achieved mastery. Behind every sortie was a logistical miracle. Carriers functioned as floating factories, with deck crews performing maintenance at sea under punishing conditions. Spare parts were staged forward, fuel convoys met schedules measured in hours, and ammunition arrived with mechanical precision. When a Hellcat returned damaged, it was often repaired rapidly and ready again by the next cycle. That efficiency meant more planes in the sky at any given moment, which in turn meant more pressure on the enemy. It was the kind of advantage that compounded daily until it became unstoppable. Statistics also revealed something deeper about human survival. The Hellcat was not only a killer, it was a savior. Pilots who flew it had significantly higher survival rates than those in earlier aircraft. Its engine could take hits and still bring men home. Its structure could absorb punishment and still land safely with holes in the wings and fuselage. Photographs from carrier decks showed returning Hellcats riddled with shrapnel yet taxiing under their own power. Each of those photographs was a victory of engineering and faith. The numbers may have looked cold on paper, but to the men who lived them, they meant everything. The Japanese knew the balance had turned. Reports captured late in the war revealed growing concern within their air commands. They noted the loss of experienced leaders, the difficulty of intercepting American carrier groups guided by radar control, and the exhaustion of ground crews working with little fuel and scarce replacements. Even the kamikaze attacks that appeared later in the conflict were, in part, reflections of this desperation. They were acts of courage and of necessity. Japan no longer had the planes or pilots to sustain conventional air combat. The Hellcat's dominance in the skies helped push them to that point. When historians later compared the performance of Allied fighters, one fact stood out for the U.S. Navy. No other American naval aircraft type in the war was credited with as many air-to-air victories as the Hellcat. Its tally sits among the very highest of any Allied fighter of the conflict. The Mustang, the Spitfire, and the Thunderbolt each earned glory in their theaters, but the Hellcat's raw totals over the Pacific remain remarkable. It was not the fastest or the sleekest on paper. It was the right airplane at the right time, serving the right doctrine. The statistics were overwhelming but not hollow. They represented the culmination of everything that had begun in the dark days of 1942. Hard-won tactics, industrial discipline, and the steady transformation of defeat into knowledge created a weapon system that could not be matched. The Hellcat was proof that America could do more than catch up. It could surpass. It turned production into power, training into precision, and resilience into victory. By the end of the war, the numbers were no longer just figures in a report. They were history itself. They showed what happens when a nation learns as one machine, and they left no doubt about who commanded the sky. By late 1944, the battle for the sky was no longer simply mechanical. It had become a struggle of nerves, endurance, and perception. For the men who fought above the Pacific, victory was measured not just in aircraft destroyed but in the slow erosion of the enemy's confidence. The Hellcat had conquered the air numerically and technically. Now it was conquering the mind. In the early years of the war, Japanese pilots flew with strong faith in their superiority. Their training was demanding, their discipline proven, and their early victories reinforced the belief that skill and courage could overcome industrial disadvantages. But the war they had known was changing. The Hellcat altered what combat felt like. Encounters that had once seemed predictable shifted into something new. American formations appeared at high altitude, coordinated by radar direction and guided by controllers aboard ships far away. When the Japanese climbed to meet them, Hellcats used altitude and speed to dive, fire with precision, and reappear from another angle. It was warfare built on systems rather than on individual instinct. The psychological turn began quietly. After the Marshalls and the Marianas, Reports from the Japanese side increasingly described the scale and persistence of American air power. Pilots noted that replacement aircraft and crews seemed to arrive without pause. The sense of confronting a limited foe was gone. They now faced a fleet that could absorb losses, redirect resources, and return in strength. Many veterans recognized that they were not only fighting airplanes but also the momentum of an industrial nation that had learned how to fight at sea. On the American side, the mood moved in the opposite direction. Hellcat pilots felt a new kind of confidence, not reckless or careless, but steady. The airplane's toughness and the clarity of doctrine created a sense that missions were survivable. Pilots trusted their machines. They trusted their wingmen. They trusted the rhythm of briefings, radar calls, and formation tactics that turned fear into concentration. In the ready rooms, the tone was not bravado. It was composure built on results and reinforced by the knowledge that even a damaged Hellcat could often bring its pilot home. The contrast deepened as the war continued. American aviators rotated home at the end of tours and passed experience into the training pipeline. Japanese aviators generally remained in combat until they were lost, which meant that each casualty drained irreplaceable knowledge from frontline units. By 1944, Japan's veteran corps had thinned severely. New pilots were brave, but less seasoned, and they were meeting opponents who had flown many missions in a rugged aircraft suited to their doctrine. That imbalance of experience placed a quiet pressure on morale that no speech could fix. The Hellcat's presence extended beyond the cockpit. It became a familiar image on the American home front. Newsreels and photographs showed the same broad-winged fighter returning to carriers and lifting off again for new strikes. Sailors and aircrew painted names and symbols on their airplanes, and ground crews kept them flying through entire campaigns. The airplane's reliability supported a culture of confidence across the fleet. For the men who worked on deck, the Hellcat was not only a weapon but a dependable partner that repaid effort with results. For the Japanese, the Hellcat's approach carried a weight that went beyond metal. Pilots and ground observers described the sound and presence of large American fighter formations arriving with altitude and direction. They knew what that combination meant. It meant radar warning, tactical control, and enough numbers to sustain attacks even after losses. The Americans had achieved not just air superiority but a kind of predictability in their operations that wore down resistance. Convoys, troop movements, and defensive positions increasingly had to be planned with the expectation that American fighters could appear faster and in greater strength than before. Psychological warfare took subtle forms. The sight of multiple carrier task groups moving across the ocean, each with decks crowded by fighters and bombers, sent a message more powerful than any leaflet. Japanese pilots often faced not a handful of opponents but many, all flying disciplined formations. Each engagement reminded them that they were fighting a network of ships, factories, schools, and procedures that acted as one. For a force shaped by a tradition of individual skill and valor, that reality was sobering. On American ships, leaders acknowledged that morale was a tool. Briefings balanced caution with confidence. Pilots were reminded that the enemy remained dangerous, yet they were shown how doctrine and teamwork created advantages that could be repeated. Squadrons developed small rituals before launches to steady nerves and reinforce unity. Music on the loudspeakers, short jokes on deck, and the familiar steps of the pre-flight check became part of a pattern that built calm under strain. It was not showmanship. It was the practical psychology of men who had to face danger every day. In the air, behavior reflected this shift. Japanese pilots who once pressed attacks sometimes broke earlier when surprised by altitude or numbers. Reports from 1945 include cases where formations disengaged when confronted by coordinated American fighters arriving from above. That change was not a matter of courage failing. It was a realistic response to altered odds. The enemy had learned what the Hellcat could do when it controlled the vertical and when it fought within a layered system of radar and direction. As the final year unfolded, the Hellcat's presence became a signal to friendlies as well. Marines and sailors on the water and ashore recognized its silhouette and the rhythm of its guns. To them, the fighter was a promise that enemy aircraft would be contested. That reassurance mattered in the psychology of amphibious warfare. Troops moving inland under fire looked up and saw a pattern they trusted, a pattern that meant the sky would not belong to the other side for long. By late 1945, many surviving Japanese pilots wrote of exhaustion and diminishing options. They had adapted where they could, but the combination of American training, radar control, logistics, and fighter performance had created an environment in which experience alone could not restore the balance. The Hellcat was part of that environment. It embodied a shift from isolated duels to coordinated action, from improvisation to practiced method, from hope to expectation. For the United States, the psychological war ended with clarity. Pilots understood that they had broken not only the enemy's formations but also his confidence in ruling the sky. The Hellcat had helped transform fear into steadiness and setbacks into a system that produced consistent results. It showed that morale in modern war grows from reliable tools, coherent doctrine, and an organization that learns faster than the opposition. The mind was the last battlefield. In that space, the Hellcat proved decisive not simply by what it destroyed, but by what it made inevitable. It made confidence routine. It made survival probable. It made victory feel like the natural outcome of disciplined effort. That is what wins the psychological war, and by the end, that war was won. By 1945, the skies above Japan had turned from a shield into a warning. What had once been the domain of the Imperial Navy's flyers was now a highway for American bombers and fighters. The Hellcat, born in the urgency of defense, had become an instrument of offense. It no longer fought only for survival. It fought to end the war. When American carriers began launching strikes directly against Japan's home islands, the change was profound. The Pacific, once a barrier, had become a runway. Task Force 58, an armada of carriers, battleships, and cruisers, moved within range of Tokyo itself. On February 16, 1945, large-scale carrier fighter sweeps over Japan began. Hellcats led the way. Their mission was not only to destroy aircraft, but to destroy the idea that Japan still controlled its own sky. Hundreds of American planes filled the horizon, and for the first time in the war, Japanese civilians watched their defenders fight above their capital. The Hellcat's broad wings gleamed in the sun, a visible sign that the tide had reached Japan's doorstep. The Japanese response was desperate but courageous. What remained of their fighter forces scrambled to intercept the raids. Many of the aircraft were improved late war types, including refined versions of the Zero and capable land-based fighters such as the Ki-84 and the N-1K. They were formidable machines, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers. Fuel was scarce, ammunition limited, and experienced pilots nearly gone. In these battles, the outcome was rarely in doubt. Hellcat squadrons, operating with radar coordination and disciplined tactics, cut through interceptors with deadly precision. Pilots reported dogfights that lasted only moments. The formations that once dictated terms disintegrated under the weight of numbers and organization. From the decks of carriers, flight operations ran with mechanical rhythm. Launch, attack, recover, refuel, rearm, and launch again. The Navy had perfected a system of continuous pressure that the Japanese could not match. Every day the carriers remained on station, hundreds of sorties rose into the air. Hellcats escorted carrier bombers against airfields, strafed trains and shipping, and swept away the last remnants of organized resistance. In Okinawa and the Ryukyus, they shielded amphibious forces and intercepted incoming attackers before they could reach the fleet. It was brutal, exhausting work, and it was effective. For the men who flew, each mission carried the weight of knowing they were grinding down an enemy that refused to surrender. The statistics of that period are stark. Between early 1945 and the war's end, American naval aviation flew tens of thousands of combat sorties across the western Pacific. Hellcats remained central to those operations, destroying large numbers of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. Yet, beyond the numbers, something larger was happening. The Hellcat was no longer just a weapon of combat. It was a symbol of inevitability. Its presence above Japan told every observer that the war's conclusion was approaching. On the ground, the psychological effect was immense. Civilians who had grown up seeing the Zero as a symbol of invincibility now looked up to see foreign fighters roaming freely over their cities. Anti-aircraft fire reached up at them, but the Hellcats came in waves too large to stop. Japanese planners recognized that air defense was collapsing faster than industry could rebuild it. Aircraft production continued, but shortages of fuel, engines, and trained pilots turned those efforts into empty numbers. The country was running out of air. The Hellcat's role evolved again in these final months. It became an enforcer of air supremacy, hunting what few targets remained. Pilots strafed locomotives, airfields, and coastal shipping, destroying the arteries of a nation already bleeding. Many described these missions with mixed feelings. There was little glory left, only duty. They were fighting not for individual victory but to shorten the war. The Hellcat's stability and endurance made it well suited for long and relentless sorties, and its crews pushed the aircraft to its limits day after day. The arrival of the kamikaze introduced a new kind of terror to the skies. Young Japanese pilots, often with minimal training, launched themselves at American ships in a final act of sacrifice. The Hellcat became the first line of defense against many of these attacks. Combat air patrols flew ceaselessly around the fleet, intercepting suicide aircraft before they could dive on their targets. Many Hellcat pilots witnessed scenes that would stay with them forever, with attackers bursting into fire under gunfire just seconds from impact. The emotion of those battles was complex. There was respect for the enemy's courage, grief for the waste, and determination to end it. By mid-1945, Japan's organized air arm had largely ceased to function as a coherent force. The U.S. Navy's carrier task forces could launch raids against priority targets at will. The Hellcat, which had begun as a defensive fighter, was now the guardian of overwhelming superiority. It patrolled over Japanese ports, flew photo reconnaissance over key approaches and airfields, and provided fighter cover for naval strikes that reached deep into the home islands. Its broad wings had carried the war from the edges of the Pacific to the enemy's homeland. When the atomic bombs fell and Japan agreed to surrender, many Hellcat pilots were at sea preparing for further strikes. The news brought a quiet to the decks. The men who had lived through years of fighting suddenly faced the end. They cleaned their planes, packed their gear, and watched the horizon knowing they would never again see it in the same way. For them, the Hellcat was more than steel and rivets. It was a companion that had taken them from the first desperate months of the war to its closing chapter. In the weeks that followed, Hellcats flew patrols during the approach of occupation forces and maintained order in the air as Allied ships entered Japanese waters. Their presence over the ruins of Tokyo and Yokohama marked a turning point not only in warfare, but in history. The fighter that had arrived as a response to early defeats had outlasted its rival and helped dismantle the system that once ruled the sky. The sky that had once belonged to the rising sun now belonged to the Americans. It was not a triumph of arrogance, but of endurance and adaptation. The Hellcat's last wartime missions were quiet ones. It guarded transport ships, watched over airfields, and then slowly disappeared from the decks it had once ruled. Newer fighters would take its place, faster and sleeker, but none would carry the same symbolic weight. It had been the workhorse of a generation, the bridge from doubt to dominance. By the time the final Hellcat squadrons returned home, the war it had fought was already turning into memory. The Pacific was quiet. The factories were silent, and the enemy who once ruled the air was rebuilding in defeat. Above it all lingered a single truth. The machine that began as a desperate response had become an instrument that helped close an era. The sky had fallen on Japan, and the Hellcat had carried it down. When the Pacific War finally ended, the story of the Hellcat became more than a chapter in military history. It became a parable of transformation. The aircraft that had been born from urgency, built in a rush to catch up, ended as one of the most successful fighters in aviation history. Its record was not measured in elegance but in effectiveness. It represented the ability to learn faster than one's enemy and to turn weakness into mastery. In the aftermath of victory, the pilots who had flown the Hellcat struggled to describe what it had meant to them. To outsiders, it was a machine. To them, it was a living thing, a companion that had carried them through fear and fire. The scars on its armor told their stories better than words. Mechanics who had worked the deck still spoke of it as though it were indestructible. They knew its quirks, its strengths, and the small details that made it trustworthy. They called it Grumman iron for a reason. It had earned its reputation by surviving what others could not. Historians would later study its record with astonishment. In just over 2 years of combat, the Hellcat accounted for more than 5,000 confirmed aerial victories, making it the top-scoring American naval fighter of the war. Its kill ratio, well above 10-to-1, stood as evidence of the total shift in the balance of power. Yet even those numbers did not capture its true impact. The Hellcat was not only a tool of destruction, it was a symbol of industrial maturity, of a nation that had learned how to combine engineering, training, and logistics into one seamless machine. After the war, many Hellcats were decommissioned or scrapped, their metal recycled into the peacetime economy they had helped secure. Others found new life in reserve units and training commands. Some served post-war with foreign operators, including the French Aéronavale, and a few were converted into drones for use as target aircraft in weapons testing. In those final flights, even as unmanned machines, they continued to serve the purpose for which they had been built: to teach, to adapt, and to prepare for what came next. The pilots moved on as well. Many returned to civilian life, carrying with them lessons forged in the air. They understood teamwork in a way few others did. They had seen what discipline, structure, and trust in one's comrades could achieve. The Hellcat had given them more than survival. It had given them perspective. They had witnessed the transformation of chaos into order, of weakness into strength. That transformation became the defining story of the war's second half. In post-war reflections, the Hellcat was often compared to the legends of the European theater: the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Messerschmitt. Each had its mythology, but the Hellcat's legacy was different. It was not romantic. It was practical, enduring, and quietly heroic. It did not dazzle with speed or finesse. It simply did what it was asked to do, again and again, until the enemy could fight no longer. In that simplicity lay its greatness. It proved that reliability can be as decisive as innovation, and that perfection is less important than consistency. Aviation writers have often described it as the fighter that won the Pacific. That title is not mere praise. It is recognition of a truth about timing and fit. Without the Hellcat's performance in 1943 and 1944, the naval campaigns that followed might have unfolded very differently. The capture of the Marianas, the invasions of the Philippines, the approach to Okinawa, all depended on air superiority, and the Hellcat delivered it. It allowed American carriers to operate freely and gave amphibious forces the cover they needed to land. Every success that followed bore its invisible signature. For Japan, the Hellcat became a grim legend of its own. Surviving pilots who wrote after the war often spoke of the American fighter with reluctant respect. They remembered its size, its durability, and the discipline of the men who flew it. Some compared its arrival to a curtain falling over the Pacific. Once it appeared, the sky was no longer theirs. They had faced an enemy that learned, and that realization stayed with them long after the fighting ended. In peacetime, a few Hellcats survived to tell their story in museums and at air shows. Their thick wings and broad fuselages still carried the smell of oil and salt air. Children who climbed the ladders to look inside saw instruments frozen at the positions they had held when the engines last stopped. For them, it was a window into a time when the world was decided in the sky. For the veterans who visited, it was something deeper. It was memory made solid. A reminder that even the darkest moments can become turning points when people refuse to give up. The lessons of the Hellcat reached beyond aviation. Military academies used its story to teach the value of adaptation. Businesses studied it as a model of how feedback and efficiency can transform failure into success. Its legacy became part of a larger American lesson that strength is not born from superiority but from persistence. In every rivet and every repair, it carried proof that mastery comes through iteration, not inspiration. Even decades later, when jet fighters ruled the skies, the Hellcat's name still commanded respect. It was the last of a certain kind of warrior, an airplane that represented the will of its builders and the courage of its pilots more than the sophistication of its technology. It stood as the bridge between the old and the new, between the age of instinct and the age of systems. In that bridge lay its immortality. The Hellcat's story began with doubt and ended with dominance, but its true power lay in the transformation between those 2 points. It was born in the fear of being outmatched and rose through the faith that learning could close any gap. Its victories were not accidents. They were the result of human beings who refused to be defined by their defeats. When the war was over and peace returned to the Pacific, the skies grew quiet again. The same wind that had once carried the sound of engines and gunfire now whispered through the hangars where the Hellcats rested. They had done their work. They had shown the world that in every weakness lies the seed of strength, waiting for the courage to grow. And for those who remembered them, the legend of the Hellcat was not about the plane itself, but about what it proved, that no force on earth can stop those who learn faster than fate. The war ended, but the shadow of the Hellcat stretched far beyond it. For a few brief years, the world had watched the greatest aerial transformation in history, and when the dust settled, the aircraft that symbolized that change was still standing, battered, outdated by jet-age standards, yet legendary. The Hellcat had not only helped win a war, it had rewritten the rules of what victory required. In the post-war years, the United States Navy transitioned into a new era. Jets began to dominate the decks, and technology advanced at a pace few could have imagined during the war. Yet the lessons of the Hellcat remained foundational. The aircraft had proven that success in air combat was not about isolated genius or daring individuals. It was about a system, about the seamless connection between design, doctrine, logistics, and the courage of ordinary men working in extraordinary coordination. Every carrier that launched jet fighters in the 1950s owed its operational philosophy to the practices first perfected with the Hellcat. Its influence was visible in the aircraft that followed. The F6F Bearcat, the last piston engine fighter from Grumman, was built directly on the Hellcat's lineage, lighter, faster, and designed using everything learned from its predecessor. Even early naval jets like the F9F Panther and Cougar inherited the same emphasis on simplicity, ruggedness, and pilot survivability. The Hellcat had set a standard that every Grumman design would quietly honor for decades. The company's reputation for building reliable, battle-hardened machines came from the iron legacy of that one aircraft. The Hellcat's reputation also became part of naval aviation's culture. It was more than a design success. It was an identity. For the pilots who had flown it, it represented the moment when naval aviation proved its maturity. Before the war, carriers were still experimental in the eyes of many strategists. After the Hellcat, they were indispensable. The aircraft had shown that a navy could project power thousands of miles from land, that air superiority could decide not only battles but entire campaigns. It had made the ocean itself a battlefield of the air. In the public imagination, the Hellcat shared the stage with the great icons of the Second World War: the Mustang over Europe, the Spitfire over Britain, the Flying Fortress over Germany. Yet its fame was quieter, more stoic. It never carried the romance of a duel over the English Channel or the dramatic narratives of long-range escort missions across Europe. Its story was one of method, endurance, and quiet professionalism. It was a machine that did its job so well that it left little drama behind. Perhaps that was the highest form of excellence, victory so complete that it erased its own struggle. Even after its retirement from frontline service, the Hellcat remained a teacher. Naval air stations used it for carrier training through the late 1940s. The drone versions, repainted bright red and radio-controlled, flew into missile tests to gather data that would shape the future of warfare. Each one that fell in a burst of fire gave scientists the information to protect the next generation of aircraft. In that sense, the Hellcat never truly stopped serving. It simply changed its purpose, from fighting to teaching. The Hellcat's legacy also survived in the memories of those it saved. Thousands of pilots returned home because of its strength. Many had limped back to their carriers with engines on fire or wings shot full of holes, only to find that the airplane refused to give up. Veterans would later say that the Hellcat had a soul, that it seemed to want to live as much as they did. Of course, it was just engineering and design, but good engineering can inspire feelings that go beyond logic. To the men who flew it, the Hellcat was proof that machines could be noble if built with care and purpose. As decades passed, museums and restorers brought surviving Hellcats back to life. Their massive engines roared again at air shows, shaking the ground just as they had in the Pacific. Audiences watched in awe as the thick-winged fighters climbed and rolled, still graceful despite their size. Veterans in the crowd often stood silently, remembering comrades who had never returned. To them, that sound was not nostalgia. It was memory reborn. The Hellcat's legacy stretched beyond the battlefield and beyond technology. It stood for a philosophy of resilience. It proved that the response to failure is more powerful than failure itself. The United States had entered the Pacific War with inferior aircraft, outmatched and unprepared. By learning, adapting, and refusing to accept defeat, it had built something that turned the tide. The Hellcat was the embodiment of that transformation, a symbol that intelligence and endurance can overcome even the sharpest early disadvantage. Today, the few remaining Hellcats are monuments not just to engineering, but to the human spirit that built and flew them. They sit in hangars and museums across the world, from Pensacola to Paris, their paint faded but their presence unshakable. Each rivet still carries the story of the young men who strapped themselves inside and trusted their lives to its strength. They remind us that every victory, no matter how technological it may seem, begins with people who refuse to stop improving. In the broader arc of history, the Hellcat's success marked the moment when American air power became global and permanent. The doctrines it proved, carrier warfare, air superiority through discipline, production as a weapon, would shape not just the next war, but the entire modern era of military thought. Even in an age of supersonic jets and digital avionics, its lessons remain valid. Build what is reliable. Train until routine becomes instinct. Learn faster than your enemy. Never stop adapting. The Pacific sky that once burned with combat is calm now. Yet the story of the Hellcat still rides on every carrier launch, every pilot briefing, and every doctrine that emphasizes teamwork over glory. It was the aircraft that transformed the impossible into the inevitable. And though time has carried it from the decks it once ruled, its shadow still falls over the sea, reminding us that power built on learning is power that endures.